Just a heads up, this video contains descriptions of real-life radiation injuries, radiation sickness, loss of life, and the loss of a child. There are some graphic pictures of injuries and burns as well. If these aren't topics you want to deal with today, then please don't watch this video. Thanks. I'm also going to mess up some pronunciations because I don't speak Brazilian Portuguese, and apologies in advance. Hi there, and welcome to Videognosis, a YouTube channel covering various aspects about television that likely no one cares about. For my first video ever, I'm going to talk about an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation and a real-life radiation disaster that seem to have some parallels. The episode in question is 1994's Thine Own Self, the 16th episode from the 7th and final season of the show. If you're not familiar with Star Trek, it's a collection of stories about a fictional universe that play out over multiple science fiction TV shows and movies mainly. Most of it is about a technologically advanced utopian future where sexism, racism, poverty, etc. are all pretty much gone and everybody lives and works for enrichment. Kind of. Newer shows are revealing that once the utopia thing gets stale, the good guys can start dabbling in war crimes or being picky about which sort of genocides to stop. You know. Basically, the formula is usually that a spaceship crew with various personalities goes on adventures in space. The Next Generation is no different and is one of the especially loved iterations of Star Trek, thanks to its adventurous, episodic plot and the cast's chemistry. In this episode's A-plot, Data, the crew's emotionless and hyperlogical but somehow super endearing android lieutenant commander...
Perhaps I should remain and further entertain our guest.
No. I'm sure you're needed on the bridge as well.
...is on an away mission to Barkon 4, a planet with a pre-industrialized civilization. He is tasked with recovering radioactive materials from a probe that crashed there. In the B-plot, the Enterprise is just floating around while Counselor Troi learns to shove her feelings down and murder a friend for the greater good. But it's not really relevant to the video, so let's forget about it. Down on Barkon 4, we see that things apparently did not go well for Mr. Data. He looks a bit singed, and despite the fact that the probe crash was miles and miles away from civilization, here he is waltzing into a settlement making computer monster noises. After some back and forth with a concerned citizen named Garvin, I definitely didn't have to re-record this 100 times because I kept referring to him as an early 2000s GPS device. We learn that Data has lost his memory, and since he can't remember what radioactive means, he hands the container he's carrying and its contents over. Uh-oh. But anyway, Data gets a cursed nickname from Garvin's daughter, Gia.
Let's call him... Jaden.
What do you think of that?
I wish you would step back from that ledge, my friend.
Jaden.
And he gets diagnosed with being an Iceman by the local doctor/schoolmarm.
Quite so, I'm sure my grandmother would have called our friend here a demon or a spirit or some sort of monster. But current scientific methodology allows us to dismiss such ridiculous superstitions and concentrate on scientific reality.
Then what do you believe I am?
You are an Iceman.
No one seems bothered, though, like, Icemen are fine, I guess. Then he and Garvin take his radioactive metals to the local blacksmith for inspection. The locals have no way of knowing the danger the metals put them in, so the blacksmith buys half the contents of the case to make jewelry with. Data keeps the rest since it might help with discovering his identity. Now, I think we can probably see where this is going. In the meantime, though, Data does a good deed and impresses the townsfolk with his Iceman strength.
Did I do something wrong, Garvin? No. Just unexpected.
Then he and his adopted family have a nice dinner, and it starts. Garvin begins to show signs of illness. Data looks as if he might break into a likely disturbing rendition of Somewhere Out There, but we're spared, for now.
Somewhere out there, if love can see us through.
The next day, Data further endears himself to the townspeople by poking holes in their beliefs.
Wood, for example, does not contain fire simply because it is combustible. Wood, like any complex organic form, is composed of thousands of different chemical compounds, none of which is fire.
That will be enough for now, Jaden. As I told you earlier, our friend Jaden here has lost much of his memory, so I wouldn't put too much faith in any of his ideas.
And settling monetary disputes with his perfect android memory.
I offered you 15 for the medal, and I've given it to you. No more.
We agreed on 20.
Garvin is correct. You agreed on 20.
Stay out of this, Iceman.
You know, aside from the amnesia part. At some point, Gia got a piece of the radioactive jewelry, and she too falls ill. Of course, as the other townspeople who have come in contact with the radioactive materials become sick, they start to blame Data.
It's his fault. None of us were sick before he came to the village.
Data launches his own investigation, though, and soon realizes the metals are the likely cause of all the problems. He sets up some low-tech experiments to confirm. Like, I don't know if there's some kind of lamp oil out there that can really show you radiation like this, but okay. Data then has the suspiciously ever-present doctor teacher round up the metal in town to replace it in the protected storage container. And then Data gets attacked by the disgruntled blacksmith and his buddy.
What are you?
Data hides, the blacksmith forms a mob, Data researches more while they're out looking for him. Eventually a cure is developed. Yes, with no memories, not even remembering what radioactivity is in the first place, Data creates a perfect cure for radiation sickness with rudimentary tools and supplies. Then he administers his creation to Gia and Garvin, before taking the rest to dump in the well so he can cure the town. He gets caught and murdered, of course, but not before he manages to dump the cure into the town's water supply, saving the day. Of course, the Star Trek audience knows by this point that Data can't really be killed this way, since, he's a machine. So a few days later, Beverly and Riker arrive in disguise to retrieve their android crewmate. They find Data buried in the town square and beam him back onto the Enterprise, along with the radioactive chunks. The townspeople are none the wiser, thankfully. Then they fix Data right back up, he loses all memory of the event and the family he worked so hard to save, and life goes on as normal. The incident this episode parallels, however, isn't wrapped up so nicely, unfortunately. Founded in 1933, Goiânia is the largest city in the Goiás state of Brazil, and it also serves as the state capital. It seems like a happy city for the most part, but it suffers from massive wealth disparity just like the rest of the world. Scavenging metal to sell as scrap was very common for Goiânia's poor in the 80s, and on the night of September 13, 1987, it would lead to a major radiation exposure disaster. That night, Roberto Alves and Wagner Pereira broke into the partially demolished building that had housed the Institute of Goiás Radiotherapy just 2 years prior. The small clinic had moved locations in 1985, but due to problems between the institute and the building's owner, some equipment had been left abandoned. Normally, a security guard patrolled the building, but he had called in sick, and the two men took the lack of surveillance as an opportunity to scavenge. Inside, they came across an external radiation therapy machine and disassembled parts of it that seemed valuable, including the housing for the radioactive cesium powder that made the radiation therapy possible. The housing was this large dome with a radiation aperture or window on the bottom. Inside the housing, there was a large capsule filled with 19 grams of cesium-137 powder, a radioactive substance. This rotating capsule also had a window on it, so that when lined up with the housing window, it would emit a beam of targeted radiation for radiating a tumor directly. Roberto and Wagner managed to remove the capsule from the housing on site and took it to Roberto's home in a wheelbarrow. They tried to disassemble it further in his yard, despite both of the men feeling ill and vomiting repeatedly that same night. Like in the Star Trek episode, they had no idea there was an invisible threat and that it was already too late. The next day, Wagner felt even worse as he developed further symptoms of radiation sickness and burns began to show on his hand. The burns were the same shape and size as the window on the cesium capsule, but Wagner either didn't notice or didn't mention that to anyone when he sought treatment, possibly to avoid any legal trouble from scavenging. He left Roberto to finish opening the capsule and headed to a nearby medical clinic. The clinic had no reason to suspect radiation, as accidental exposure is so rare, especially in Brazil, so they diagnosed him with a severe food allergy and sent him home to rest and recover. A couple days later, on September 16th, Roberto, on his own, was successful in puncturing a hole in the capsule with the screwdriver, and he was surprised to see an eerie blue light emanating from inside. Likely this glow was the result of Cherenkov radiation, which is kind of above my pay grade to explain, so maybe check out Wikipedia. He scooped some of the cesium powder out with the screwdriver, and unable to recognize the substance, attempted to light it on fire to see if it was some kind of gunpowder. Luckily, that didn't seem to do anything. On the 18th of September, the capsule changed hands, sold now to Devair Ferreira, who lived adjacent to the junkyard that he managed. Later in the night, after the capsule had been brought to his property and further disassembled by his employees, Devair noticed the blue glow. This caused him to bring the capsule inside his house, thinking the contents must be valuable or maybe even supernatural in some way. De Valliere and his wife Maria then began to invite others to see the blue light. For 3 days, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, and family all trekked to and through De Valliere and Maria's home to witness the glow, all unknowingly exposing themselves to dangerous levels of radiation. On the 23rd, one friend managed to extract the glowing powder, like Roberto did, with a screwdriver. Still believing the powder to be magical or special in some way, De Valliere began to remove more of it and gave small amounts out to family and friends. De Valliere's brothers, Odisson and Ivo, were also given some of the radioactive powder. Odisson, like the blacksmith in the episode, first thought of making some jewelry with the powder. When he actually had the powder and rubbed it into his hand, he decided he wasn't actually impressed with it though and lost interest. Not knowing the powder was harming himself and everyone he came in contact with, Odisson left his brother's home and returned to his job as a bus driver, spreading the radiation further into the city. Ivo, on the other hand, became enchanted with the powder, much like De Valliere. On the evening of September 24th, he spread some of the glowing powder out on a concrete floor for his 6-year-old daughter, Lady Ferreira, to play with. She aspired to be a fashion model someday, so she was super excited to try this glowing makeup that her dad had brought home, and she applied it all over her skin. She then ate a boiled egg with the powder still on her hands, ingesting some of it. She started to get sick later that night. Meanwhile, though, Wagner's illness wasn't getting any better with rest, so he sought treatment again. Because of the prolonged symptoms and the fact that radiation sickness was still far from the minds of local doctors, Wagner was thought to have some kind of disease. So he was transferred to the Tropical Diseases Hospital on September 27th. By the 28th, many people were very sick, including Maria Ferreira, and it was starting to become obvious to Maria that the more time she and others spent around the capsule, the worse they felt. She loaded the capsule and all of its pieces into a woven plastic sack. She convinced one of her husband's employees to carry this massively radioactive bag for her, and the two took a bus to a local hospital called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. Reportedly, she dropped the bag on a doctor's desk and said that the contents were killing her family, demanding his help with the situation. Maria was admitted to the hospital, but the doctor dismissed her concerns about the bag. At first. Throughout the day, though, the idea that there could be something dangerous in the bag gnawed at him. Later on in the afternoon, he placed the bag outside. Back at the Tropical Disease Hospital, there was an influx of patients with the same symptoms as Wagner, who was still being treated in the hospital as well. Luckily, though, a doctor there known only as Dr. R.P. suspected radiation when examining the skin lesions many of the patients exhibited. Both he and the Vigilancia Sanitaria eventually contacted a medical physicist named Walter Ferreira, who is of no relation to the Ferreira family previously mentioned. Walter just happened to be visiting Goiânia, so he agreed to check out the situation, and managed to obtain a device with which to measure radiation. He rushed to the location of the cesium capsule, and thankfully arrived just in time. The local fire department, who had also been contacted by the hospital, were planning to toss the capsule into a local river to dispose of it. After taking a reading of the capsule and discovering that the scale of radiation it was putting out was more than the meter could even read, Walter convinced the hospital staff to evacuate the building and barred anyone else from re-entering. Once the doctor that had dealt with Maria explained what she had told him, the two men hurried to the junkyard to test the radiation levels there. After that, they acted quickly. They convinced the neighborhood of the danger and had everyone evacuate. And then it was on to the Goiás government for help. It took some convincing because, once again, the situation seemed too incredible to believe at first. Luckily, though, they were eventually able to notify the Secretary for Health in Goiás, and from there, authorities were notified all down the chain of command. Once victims were interviewed, authorities were able to travel to the major sites that the cesium capsule had visited to evacuate residents and evaluate contamination levels. The Brazilian military was brought in to remove the capsule. On September 29th, a screening and isolation center was set up at the Pedro Ludovico Olympic Stadium. Over 112,000 citizens were screened, and 249 were found to be contaminated in some way. The cleanup process began at the most severely radiated sites, like the original clinic, the houses where the capsule itself and the powder spent time, the hospital where Maria brought the capsule, etc. In total, 7 principal contamination sites were found. There were an additional 42 locations that were a bit less of a priority, but still needed to be decontaminated. In total, 7 homes were completely demolished. Victims have said that those with demolished homes and destroyed items were left with nothing and nowhere to return to. 550 workers, some traveling from other parts of Brazil, managed to decontaminate the principal sites before Christmas, so some survivors could be home for the holidays. Once Christmas was past, work began on cleaning up the remaining radiation. Cars, buses, shops, sidewalks, pets, livestock, vegetation, and topsoil were among things that were found to be contaminated in various areas. Not only had contaminated people and items made their way around the city and state, but radioactive dust had been blown around from sites where the capsule had been kept outside. Luckily, no water sources were found to be contaminated. All of the contaminated things, though, were either cleaned if possible, or they were destroyed if they were too contaminated, including animals. The radioactive waste from the decontamination efforts was taken to a holding site about 20 kilometers, or 12 miles, outside of the city. In total, there were 3,500 cubic meters, or 3,850 tons of waste stored in 3,800 metal drums, 1,400 metal boxes, 10 shipping containers, and 6 sets of concrete packaging. So, the radiation is supposedly cleaned up now, but what happened to those affected? In total, 49 people were immediately hospitalized. 20 of them were serious enough to require time in intensive treatment, and 10 were considered critical for a time. Unfortunately, 4 people lost their lives soon after the event. On October 23rd, Lady and Maria were the first to pass away. Lady, still worried about her future modeling career, apparently asked repeatedly if the hair she lost from exposure would grow back. Maria had been the one to call attention to the accident in the first place. On the 27th and 28th, respectively, 2 of Devair's employees also passed away. Israel Santos and Admilson de Souza were the employees that originally dismantled more of the capsule for Devair. Though Devair received more radiation than literally any other victim, it is thought that he survived because he often left the house and his exposure was more fragmented than the others. But all of these victims were isolated in the hospital from most staff, other patients, and even their own families. They were still contaminated and therefore dangerous to be around. So these deaths occurred in near isolation and were especially heartbreaking. All 4 were buried in lead coffins, encased in concrete and then marble. To add to the suffering of the survivors, especially those in the Ferreira family, Goiânia locals physically protested the burials for fear of further contamination. They actually came to the funerals and threw rocks at the caskets and mourners as the burials took place. Though others survived the incident, they didn't all come out unscathed. Wagner eventually recovered, but he lost several fingers in the process. Roberto came away with his right forearm amputated, but there wasn't a lot of further information about his fate. Devair passed away in 1994. While his official cause of death is liver cirrhosis due to alcoholism, his family say his autopsy revealed he was also suffering from several forms of cancer. Ivo Ferreira passed away in 2003 from emphysema. His wife, Lourdes Ferreira, says that most survivors threw themselves totally into their addictions and vices. So that, combined with the radiation, led to much shorter lives for many. Several others sustained burns and hair loss, and many eventually recovered, for the most part. According to the Brazilian government and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the victims of the accident have been monitored by the Brazilian government since the cleanup. They have been compensated monetarily, provided health care, and they, along with the cleanup crews, have been provided mental health services. The victims themselves claim that's not exactly the case, though. After losing his bus driving job due to his injuries and local stigma, Odasson Ferreira has become an activist, speaking out for those who have been affected by the radiation accident. Odasson, Lourdes, Luisa dos Santos, who's one of Lady's aunts, and others who were affected by the radiation have given interviews contradicting what the government and the IAEA say. The Goiás government claims that there has been no significant increase in cancer within the population surrounding the contaminated areas, but local doctors report that there have been over 20 more cancer diagnoses in a small area that are likely related to the exposure. Survivors also say that the benefits they received have dwindled over time. They no longer have reliable access to healthcare, and many never received help at all. Apparently, there were limits on who exactly could claim benefits in the first place. Only those directly exposed to the capsule or powder, some of their direct descendants, and those who took part in the cleanup would qualify for any compensation. This left many neighbors who were radiated without ever even seeing or knowing about the capsule with debilitating medical conditions and no care. Hypertension, gastritis, and osteoporosis are said to be some of the conditions that even young adults are dealing with near the contamination sites. The survivors, especially those with physical disfigurements, say they face discrimination in their day-to-day lives. Other people in the community fear them as if they are still contaminated or taunt them with accusations such as saying that they glow at night from radiation. It has made working or even just having a normal home life very difficult. They can't afford to go elsewhere, but they're hated in their community. At the time of the incident, Brazil was just starting its own nuclear program, and it was already being protested. It is asserted by many journalists that the lack of information stemmed from the desire to distance this accident from Brazil's official nuclear program in order to avoid more opposition from the public. It kind of backfired, though, as much of the public was unintentionally misinformed, so a lot of people began to irrationally fear radiation, even when the danger eventually passed. But in the end, legally, the Institute of Goiás Radiotherapy was the only entity punished in any way. The owners of the facility were fined 1.3 million Brazilian real, which went towards some of the radiation victims. In real life, outside of court, multiple parties shared some of the blame, though, like the owner of the building who delayed equipment removal, and the Goiás government who were aware of the abandoned machine, but didn't step in until it was too late. None of the victims who were exposed to radiation were charged with any crimes, and rightfully so. They were doing what they could to get by and had no idea what would happen. Roberto and Wagner had no recognizable warnings that day in the clinic, but it took 20 more years for a standardized international warning to be created. Today, most outside of those specific neighborhoods where these events took place see this incident as a distant memory. Those still living there, though, especially the ones who were alive during the accident, still carry a lot of scars and trauma. It's a far cry from the almost saccharine ending of the Star Trek episode in question. But were the other events in this episode inspired by the Goiânia accident? Despite the show's almost sitcom-esque need to return to normalcy by the end of each episode, which accounts for the happy ending, a lot of the other events do line up. The townspeople handling the metal in the capsule without understanding the danger, the radioactive materials being sold as scrap, the desire for jewelry made from the dangerous substance, a child becoming enamored with radioactive materials and becoming sick, and widespread radiation sickness. There are a lot of differences as well, though. The episode plays out a bit like James Whale's 1931 film Frankenstein, with the mob and Data befriending a little girl. And here seems to be the actual inspiration for the episode. Some of the companion books apparently detail this episode's production, and this episode was pitched as Star Trek's Data becomes Frankenstein. It's funny they mentioned him befriending Gia specifically being a Frankenstein reference. I feel that's one of the weaker parts of this episode. Comparing this episode to one like Season 5's Hero Worship, where Data rescues a traumatized young boy who has lost his family and crew in the near annihilation of the ship he lived on, Gia and Data's relationship falls a little flat. In Gia's case, Data is far more preoccupied with his lost memory and research, understandably. In Hero Worship, though, the rescued boy begins to emulate Data when he learns that androids don't experience painful, or really any, emotions. And Data realizes his reverence and obsession with humanity can eventually help the boy face his problems and return to being human. It's a lot more memorable and impactful, so it kind of strikes me as odd that Gia and Data's friendship is supposed to be a major focal point of this episode. Is it possible that the Goiânia incident still inspired some of the other parts of this episode, though? Sure. But personally, I think if the writer was inspired by Goiânia, he lemoned it.
Ah, you should have come to me for your fake name. My executive, Dale Snitterman. Okay, in this instance, the creative process was that I saw that
Massive radiation disaster.
forgot that I saw it, and said it later.
The real-life incident occurred in 1987, and this episode of Star Trek didn't air until 1994. As far as I could find, before recently, there were only a couple of small articles about the accident in American newspapers, so if the writer had seen it, he likely wasn't often being reminded about it. I just think that if there had been a conscious effort to base the story on Goiânia, there might have been more of a mention of that, even if just to the people who made those companion books. Or I think there might have been more of an obvious moral or message to the story. In my personal opinion, it's all very likely just a coincidence. Though I think the mystery illness aspect of the episode is more interesting than the on-the-nose Frankenstein references. Too many of the story details that are similar just weren't known outside of Brazil. Like I said before, the incident was hardly reported on in America. I don't know though, what did you think? How similar do the two stories seem to you? Leave a comment about it or leave a comment with your thoughts on this video because it's over.